Today, as we celebrate and give thanks for 100 years of gospel ministry by the Anglican Church here in Balgowlah, I'd like to take us through a bit of a brief historical timeline of just some of the events of that 100-year period. Before the parish of All Saints Balgowlah actually came into being, it was for many years a very small part of the large parish of St Matthew's Manly, which extended from Pittwater to Killarney Heights, Middle Harbour and along the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean. What was once one parish has now become more than 10 parishes. And now we begin today's historical timeline in 1922. At the beginning of that year, the only hall in Balgowlah was the Methodist Church Hall, and members of the Balgowlah Progress Association thought it a good idea to build a Balgowlah Public Hall, which was opened in the first week of August 1922. The Church of England people from Balgowlah, with the permission of the Reverend A.G. Stoddart, the rector of St Matthew's Parish, of which Balgowlah was a part, arranged to hold services and Sunday school in this hall. And so, on Sunday the 6th of August 1922 at 7:30 p.m, the first Church of England service was held in the Balgowlah Hall on Sydney Road. The attendance was 73. The first Church of England Sunday School was held on that same day, attended by 56. Mrs. H.E. Wyndham joined the staff the following Sunday and became superintendent. Now, the need for a building belonging to the church was strongly felt, and a meeting was called for the 4th of April 1923, at which 37 were present. A committee was formed, and it was unanimously decided to hold a fete to raise money towards a church building fund. The fete raised over £144. Now, I don't know if this picture is from that particular fete, but here's a photo from a church fete in the 1920s. Sunday school was held each Sunday, and evening services were held each week until the 30th of December 1923, when the Reverend Stoddart discontinued the services due to ill health. Mrs. Wyndham, however, continued the Sunday school, which carried on without a break. In 1924, the Reverend Stoddart, who'd been rector of St Matthew's Parish since 1894, died. And the Reverend A.R. Ebbs became rector of the parish from 1924 to 1948. And so then, on the 7th of December 1924 at 7:15 p.m, after a lapse of approximately 12 months, church services were resumed in the Balgowlah Hall with an evening service. Thereafter, Holy Communion services were held at 8 a.m. and evening services at 7:30 p.m. on alternate Sundays. Roman Catholic services were also held in the Balgowlah Hall, alternating with the Church of England services. In due course, a general meeting was called in the Balgowlah Hall to decide what name should be given to the church in Balgowlah. After much discussion, it was proposed by the rector, Reverend Ebbs, and seconded by Mrs. Wyndham, that the Church of England in this district of Balgowlah be called All Saints. Exactly, All Saints, and that was carried unanimously. On the 22nd of January 1925, a block of land was purchased in Condamine Street. It had a 50-foot frontage to Condamine Street and extended back to Jackson Street. The foundation stone for the new hall on this site was laid on the 31st of October 1925. The hall was erected quite quickly. The last service was held in the Balgowlah Public Hall on the 20th of December 1925, and then 3 days later, on 23 December 1925 at 7:45 p.m, the new All Saints Church Hall in Condamine Street was opened and dedicated by the Reverend Ebbs, with over 300 people present. 2 days later, on Christmas Day 1925, there were 72 communicants at the 6:30 a.m. service of Holy Communion. Here's a picture of the All Saints Church Hall in Condamine Street. There we go. And here's another picture, I understand, inside that church hall. The first confirmees prepared in Balgowlah were confirmed on the 29th of June 1926. Okay, so to 1928. On the 1st of April 1928, the new provisional district of St Paul's Middle Harbour was formed, and on the 1st of June 1928, the Reverend R.K. Robinson commenced. Moving on to the 1930s. On the 30th of November 1934, Reverend Robinson preached his last sermon at All Saints, and on the 2nd of December 1934, the Reverend W.J. Owens commenced as rector, continuing until 1950. In 1937, the status of the parish was raised from that of a provisional to a parochial district. And jumping ahead to the 1940s, 10 years later, in 1947, the district was raised to a parish. 4 churches were part of this parish: St Peter's Manly Vale, St Paul's Seaforth, All Saints Balgowlah, and St Michael's North Balgowlah. Now, in terms of buildings, since opening the first church hall in Condamine Street in late 1925, another very significant step was taken on Saturday the 1st of March 1947 with the laying of the foundation stone for a new church hall in Boyle Street. Here's a photo from a church fete during the construction of the new church hall. And here's some photos from Saturday the 7th of August 1948 when the new building in Boyle Street was dedicated. And here's some photos of the new church hall itself. Firstly, obviously from the outside. And then next from inside. On the 8th of August 1948, the Governor of New South Wales, Sir John Northcott, attended a service at All Saints Balgowlah. Services were held in this building in Boyle Street until 1969. And the remnants of this building can still be seen in the 3 older style windows in the current church auditorium, the lower hall and the roof in the upper hall. Okay, to the 1950s. In early 1950, the Reverend W.J. Owens concluded his ministry in the parish, and in that year, the Reverend W.K. Deasy commenced. The Deasys had 5 children, and the rectory on Sydney Road, on the same side as the present rectory, was a very old single-storey brick building. When a rectory was built at Seaforth, though, the Deasys moved there, and assistant ministers were then housed at the old rectory on Sydney Road, which, in anticipation of the division of the parish into 2 parishes, was later replaced in 1961 by a new rectory on Sydney Road. So to the 1960s. In 1962, the Reverend Clive Brown commenced, the first rector of the new parish of All Saints Balgowlah and St Peter's Manly Vale. Reverend Brown moved into the new rectory at 311 Sydney Road, and he remained rector here until 1972. During Reverend Brown's tenure, there was significant building work in the parish. In 1965, the church building at Manly Vale was completed, and in 1966, St Peter's at Manly Vale joined with Allambie Heights to become a new provisional district. Some Crown land at Balgowlah Heights had been released for building. And so on the 11th of September 1966 at 3 p.m, the new dual-purpose church and hall of St James Balgowlah Heights, as a daughter church within the parish of All Saints Balgowlah, was opened and dedicated by the Most Reverend M.L. Lone. And here's a later photo of the St James Hall. St James had only Sunday morning services with quite a large congregation, including a Sunday school. But unfortunately, over time, numbers dwindled significantly, and the services were eventually moved to All Saints Balgowlah. In terms of various ministries operating here in Balgowlah, the building in Condamine Street continued to be used for Sunday school, youth fellowship and SEBS up until 1970. Of course, it has since been demolished though, and the site has become an open-air council car park behind some restaurants on Sydney Road, accessed from Condamine Street. Okay, in 1969 though, the new church building in Boyle Street, the auditorium we're now seated in, was constructed at a cost of $45,000. In April 1969, Sir Roden Cutler unveiled the foundation stone, and on the 21st of September 1969, the building was opened and dedicated by the Most Reverend M.L. Lone. One of the features of this new church auditorium would be 3 additional sets of stained glass windows by glass artist Philip Handel, whose mother and aunt sang in the church choir. And so here's a photo from inside the church auditorium, and here's a sketch from inside the auditorium. With the new church building constructed, the original church building in Boyle Street was then renovated to become a 2-storey church hall. And once the second level floor had been laid, the roof was raised using, I'm told, a very unique method. So one Saturday morning, a number of men from the church gathered together, bringing their car jacks, which were apparently installed strategically under the roof and were then systematically and collectively raised to increase the height of the roof. And now you'll be very happy to know that subsequently additional support and structure replaced those car jacks. On the Sunday of the 6th of August 1972, the church marked its 50th anniversary, celebrating the occasion with a special dinner in the parish hall on Saturday the 5th of August at 7 p.m. Following Reverend Clive Brown, the next rector of the parish was the Reverend Kelvin Tutt, who served here from 1973 until 1985. Reverend Tutt was also Rural Dean of Warringah from 1978 to 1985. Turning then to the 1980s and briefly again to the site up at Balgowlah Heights. While a private kindergarten had, under the direction of Mrs. Pease, leased the site of St James Balgowlah Heights during the week for a number of years, in 1984, St James Anglican Kindergarten started with Nadine Britton as its first director. It continued as a pack-away kindergarten so that church and Sunday school could happen on Sundays. Mandy Phillips took over from Nadine as director from 1987. And just to jump ahead very briefly, in 1995, St James Anglican Kindergarten was incorporated as per Sydney Diocesan directions to become St James Kindergarten Incorporated. The Christian ethos and connection to All Saints was maintained with 5 members of the management committee appointed by parish council. Okay, back to the 1980s. Following Reverend Kelvin Tutt, the Reverend Baden Wynne served as rector of the parish from 1985 until 1994. In 1987, a new rectory was built at 1 Barina Drive, Balgowlah Heights, and so Reverend Wynne and his family moved from the Sydney Road rectory to this new rectory at Barina Drive. Another minister at All Saints during this period was the Reverend John Capper, who had a significant ministry in the parish between Reverend Wynne leaving and the new rector, the Reverend Ken Coleman, beginning. Reverend Coleman, who'd been a retired missionary and Australian Director of the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, served as rector of the parish from 1994 until 1997. In 1997, the Reverend Cliff McDonnell, who's... Yay, absolutely. The Reverend Cliff MacDonald, who's travelled from Tasmania to be here with us today as a special guest preacher, became rector of the parish of Balgowlah until March 2020. On the 7th of December 2001, a new 5.5 metre steeple and cross was installed on the church building, as the previous church spire, which had lost its cross in 1997, had been removed in July 2000 after being damaged in a storm. Here's a picture of All Saints from 2008. During Reverend MacDonald's time, a major renovation of the church site in Boyle Street was undertaken. Bob Bucknell, who will be reading the Bible for us today, was a significant player in this building project. After final services at Boyle Street on Sunday, the 25th of February 2018, from March 2018, the 8 a.m. congregation moved to Fairlight for Sunday services, and the other two Sunday services moved to Holy Trinity, Beacon Hill. Here's a picture of the newly refurbished All Saints site. Doesn't it look wonderful? And on Wednesday, the 20th of March 2019, this site was officially opened at a special service with regular Sunday services resuming on site the following Sunday. I'd like to acknowledge that Reverend MacDonald finished at All Saints Balgowlah just as Sydney was entering into its first COVID lockdown in March 2020. And so very sadly, after 23 years of ministry here, Cliff's midweek farewell dinner had to be cancelled, and his final sermon had to be pre-recorded and streamed on his last Sunday to people at home. I just wanted to say I am so delighted that Cliff's able to be here today, and can we again thank Cliff and Jenny for their faithful service in this parish for nearly a quarter of a century, and for being here again today and serving us here. The Reverend David Ray became acting rector from late March 2020, significantly assisted, of course, by the Reverend Jimmy Shepherd. And in April 2021, I became rector of the parish of Balgowlah. In 2020, St James Kindergarten Incorporated had changed its name to St James Preschool Incorporated, and in 2022, a major redevelopment or upgrade to St James Preschool's outdoor playground was completed. Which brings us to today, the 9th of October 2022, the day that we've combined our three services and come together as one church family at 10 a.m. to celebrate 100 years since the first Anglican service was conducted in Balgowlah. We acknowledge with gratitude that saints, both past and present, have faithfully served God and his church here in Balgowlah over these past 100 years. We thank God for the faithfulness, prayers, service and sacrifice of all who've gone before us. And we praise God for who he is and for all that he has done and is doing and will do. To God be all the glory. And as Almighty God continues to lead us forward, I can't wait to see what God will do in and amongst and through his saints here at All Saints in the years to come. Friends, I do hope that you've enjoyed this brief history of 100 years of gospel ministry by the Anglican Church here in Balgowlah. Thank you.